The rain fell heavy over the streets of New York that October morning, turning the sidewalks into mirrors of gray and amber. Elena Rossi stood outside the wrought iron gates of the Moretti estate, her small suitcase clutched in one hand, a worn manila envelope in the other. Her fingers trembled, not from the cold, but from the weight of what lay ahead. She had been running for so long, running from whispers, from pity, from the suffocating sympathy of people who looked at her as if she were already broken. The job posting had appeared online like a lifeline. Nanny needed for private household. Discretion required. High compensation. No questions asked. It was vague enough to be intriguing, specific enough to feel safe. A fresh start. A place where nobody knew her name or her history. The gates opened without her touching them. Someone inside had been watching. Elena's breath caught in her throat as she walked through, her shoes echoing against the cobblestones. The mansion rose before her like something from another century, all marble columns and dark windows, beautiful in the way that dangerous things often are. The afternoon light cast long shadows across the facade, creating the illusion that the house itself was watching her, judging her worthiness to enter. She was greeted at the door by a woman named Margaret. Severe, professional, her gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her face. Margaret didn't smile. Margaret didn't ask how Elena's journey had been. She simply took the suitcase and began walking, her heels clicking against Italian marble floors that gleamed like ice. The mansion swallowed them both as they moved deeper inside. The rooms were endless, high ceilings adorned with frescoes that had faded with time, paintings of stern-faced men in expensive frames, furniture that looked uncomfortable, chosen for appearance rather than use. Everything was perfect. Everything was cold. And nowhere in this perfection was there evidence of life, of laughter, of play, of the kind of chaos that children naturally bring into a space. Margaret finally stopped before two massive oak doors on the third floor. When she pushed them open, Elena's breath caught again, but this time for a different reason. Before her was a nursery that seemed frozen in time. Two small beds with white lace canopies. A wardrobe filled with expensive clothes, still with tags attached. Toys arranged with such precision they looked like museum exhibits, untouched and lonely. And in the corner, sitting on the floor with her knees drawn up to her chest, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 5 years old. Her hair was dark and tangled, her eyes fixed on nothing. The other bed was empty, its sheets smooth, its pillows undisturbed. Margaret's voice cut through the silence like a knife. She explained in clipped, businesslike tones that the child's name was Sophia. Her twin sister Julia was resting in the adjacent room. Their mother had passed away 14 months ago. Their father, Dominic Moretti, had made arrangements for professional care. Elena was to manage the children's daily routine, their meals, their education. She was to maintain absolute confidentiality. She was to speak to no one about what she saw in this house. She was to ask no questions. In return, she would receive more money than she had ever imagined. When Margaret left, the silence that descended was so complete it felt like a living thing. Elena stood very still, watching the small girl on the floor. Sophia hadn't looked at her once. Her eyes remained fixed on the empty space before her, as if she were looking through the walls, through time itself, to somewhere far away and unreachable. Elena knelt down slowly, moving with the kind of deliberation that animals recognize as non-threatening. She didn't speak. She didn't reach out to touch. She simply sat, sharing the small girl's silence, waiting for whatever would come next. Outside, the rain continued to fall, and inside the Moretti mansion, a woman with no past and a child with no future began their first moment together. 3 weeks passed before Sophia smiled. Elena had learned not to expect it, had learned to find meaning in the smallest moments. A moment when Sophia's hand lingered in hers, an extra second longer than necessary. A moment when the girl's eyes tracked her across the room instead of staring vacantly at the wall. A moment when she ate 2 spoonfuls of soup instead of 1. Julia, in her adjacent room, was different. Where Sophia was silent and withdrawn, Julia was restless, her small body unable to settle, her eyes too alert, as if she were constantly preparing for the next disappointment. She had refused to leave her room for the first 2 weeks. She had thrown things. She had screamed in the dark. But Elena had remained. She had cleaned up the broken things without sighing. She had sat in the dark room without turning on the lights, without speaking. without demanding anything except that Julia simply exist in the same space. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, something had shifted. It began with stories. Elena had discovered in the mansion's library a collection of old books, fairy tales and adventures, the kind that children everywhere recognize as portals to other worlds. She started reading to them in the evenings, her voice quiet and steady, filling the silence that lived in that nursery like an unwanted guest. She read about brave princes and enchanted forests, about storms that cleared to reveal stars, about children who found their way home even when they were lost. The girls didn't respond at first, but they listened. Elena could feel the shift in their breathing, the way their small bodies relaxed as her words created a protective cocoon around them. And then one evening, as she read about a girl who had lost her way but learned to find joy in unexpected places, Sophia's small hand reached out and grasped Elena's sleeve. It was a grip so tentative, so fragile, that Elena nearly wept. She continued reading, her voice unchanged, but inside her something fundamental had broken open. This child, this tiny girl who had learned too young that the world could take everything from you, had chosen, in this small moment, to trust. The smile came 3 days later. Elena had brought a record player up to the nursery, something she'd found in one of the mansion's abandoned rooms. She played soft classical music, and while Julia drew with colored pencils and Sophia sat quietly beside her, Elena began to move, not dancing exactly, but swaying, allowing her body to express something her words could not. Sophia watched. Her dark eyes followed every motion, and then something flickered across her small face. A thought, a memory, perhaps a recognition of something beautiful and good. Her mouth curved upward. It was barely perceptible, a smile so small it might have been imagined, but it was real. The world shifted that day. From that moment, the transformation accelerated. The girls began to eat more. They ventured out of the nursery and explored the mansion's vast halls. They laughed, tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence. The house, which had seemed so cold and hostile, began to warm in increments. Toys started appearing in unexpected places. Drawings were taped to walls. The girls' laughter echoed through corridors where only silence had lived before. But Elena remained aware of a presence that moved through the house like a shadow. Dominic Moretti. She had not yet seen him. Not truly. There were glimpses. A tall figure passing at the far end of a hallway, footsteps on the floor above during the night. The subtle rearrangement of things in the mansion that suggested someone else occupied this space. She heard his voice occasionally, always on the phone, always speaking in low, rapid Italian that she couldn't quite follow. The staff feared him. Elena had observed this immediately, the way they moved around the mansion with efficiency and silence, careful never to make eye contact with anyone as if visibility itself were a liability. Margaret had warmed slightly toward Elena, a thaw so minimal it might have been imperceptible to anyone else, which Elena interpreted as a sign that she was not, in fact, a temporary fixture. It was on a Tuesday evening, as Elena was putting the girls to bed, that everything changed. She had just finished reading them a story. Sophia was already drowsy, her head resting on her pillow, her breathing settling into the rhythm of sleep. Julia was fighting it, as she always did, her eyes blinking slower and slower. Elena was in that transitional space between the nursery and the hallway, preparing to close the door when she felt it, a presence behind her. She turned slowly, her heart quickening in a way she couldn't quite explain. He stood in the hallway, silhouetted against the soft light from the sconces. Dominic Moretti. Even in shadow, his presence was undeniable, a physical force that seemed to displace the air around him. He was taller than she had imagined, with shoulders that spoke of someone accustomed to carrying weight. His face was obscured by darkness, but she could feel his gaze, could sense the intensity of his observation. For a moment, neither of them moved. Elena found herself unable to breathe, unable to look away. She had prepared herself for this meeting, but no amount of preparation could have adequately readied her for the actual reality of him. The way his presence seemed to fill the corridor, the way her body responded to his proximity with a mixture of fear and something else she couldn't name. Then he turned his head slightly, looking past her, into the nursery where his daughters slept peacefully. The angle of his face shifted, and in the light from the children's room, Elena saw him clearly for the first time. His features were strong, angular, beautiful in the way that things built for survival rather than comfort often are. But it was his eyes that arrested her, dark eyes that held such depth of emotion, such carefully controlled pain, that she had to look away. He stood there, watching his daughter sleep, and in that moment, Elena understood something fundamental about this man. Beneath the power, beneath the control, beneath whatever darkness had shaped his world, there lived a father, a man devastated by loss, a man trying desperately to hold together the pieces of a life that had shattered. He didn't acknowledge her. He didn't speak. He simply stood in the doorway, watching his daughters as if they might disappear if he looked away. And then, as silently as he had appeared, he turned and walked back down the hallway, his footsteps fading into the silence of the mansion. Elena closed the nursery door and returned to her small room on the 4th floor. She sat on the edge of her bed in the darkness, her hands trembling. Something had shifted tonight, something beyond the subtle improvement in the girl's condition, something that moved beneath the surface of everyday reality, like a current beneath still water. She didn't yet understand what it meant, but she knew, with a certainty that ran bone deep, that nothing would ever be the same again. The winter came early that year, bringing cold rain and the kind of darkness that settled over New York in late November and refused to leave until spring. Elena had been in the mansion for 4 months now, and the girls had blossomed in ways that seemed almost miraculous. Sophia was talkative now, her voice like music in the halls. Julia had become adventurous, exploring every corner of the mansion with the fearless curiosity of childhood rekindled. But Elena had also become aware of other elements of this house, elements that didn't fit neatly into the narrative of a grieving father and his beloved children. There were visitors who arrived at night, men who moved through the mansion with the coiled tension of those accustomed to violence. There were phone calls that caused Dominic's jaw to tighten, conversations in rapid Italian that carried a tone of command and authority. There were locked rooms on the 2nd floor that no one was permitted to enter, and there were absences, entire nights when Dominic would disappear, and the mansion would fill with a different kind of tension, a collective holding of breath that suggested everyone in the house was waiting for him to return. Elena asked no questions. She had agreed to discretion, and she was a woman who honored her commitments, but she was not naive. She understood, in the vague way that intelligent people understand things they've never explicitly been told, that Dominic Moretti's wealth did not come from legitimate sources, that the fear in the staff's eyes when certain visitors arrived was not baseless, that the mansion itself was a kind of fortress, with security measures disguised as architectural details. But none of this changed what she saw when she watched him with his daughters. Over the months, Dominic had begun to appear more frequently in the nursery. At first, he would come late at night, after the girls were asleep, standing in the doorway like a ghost haunting his own home. But gradually he began to venture in while they were awake. He would sit with them during breakfast, his dark presence somehow softened by the simple joy his daughters showed at having him there. He began to read to them, not the gentle stories Elena preferred, but adventure tales and myths, stories of heroes and quests of people who overcame impossible odds. And Elena would watch them, Dominic and his daughters, and she would see in him a man trying desperately to be something other than what the world had made him. A man attempting, in the small moments of his day, to create goodness in a life that had been built on something far darker. Their eyes had met countless times across the nursery, across the breakfast table in the hallways of the mansion. At first, those glances were brief, almost accidental. But as weeks turned into months, something changed in the quality of those moments. The glances lingered. They carried weight. And in those moments of eye contact, Elena felt something shift in her body, a quickening, a warming, a response to his presence that was simultaneously terrifying and inevitable. She told herself it was nothing. She was hired help. He was her employer. He was grieving. She was running. This was not a story that could end well. But the heart rarely listens to reason, and Elena's heart had begun to recognize something in Dominic. Not the Mafia boss, not the dangerous man who commanded fear, but the person who stood in the nursery doorway at midnight, unable to stop watching his daughters breathe. Then came the night that changed everything. It was late November. Rain hammered against the mansion windows with the force of something alive and angry. Elena had put the girls to bed early, reading to them as the storm raged outside, their small bodies nestled against hers as she sat between their beds. By 9 o'clock they were both deeply asleep, and Elena was preparing to retreat to her room when she heard it. A sound different from the storm, something sharp and urgent. Gunfire. Her body recognized the sound before her mind could fully process it. She moved instinctively, pulling a blanket over the girls, ensuring they were secure in their beds. The sound came again, rapid, violent, coming from somewhere in the lower levels of the mansion. Shouting followed, men's voices raised in panic and command. Elena's training kicked in, the survival instinct that had sustained her through a past she never spoke about. She locked the nursery doors and positioned herself near the girls' beds, her body a shield, her senses acute and aware of everything. Minutes stretched like hours. The sounds intensified, then began to fade. The shouting stopped. The gunfire ceased. A terrible silence descended, broken only by the relentless rain against the windows. It was in this silence that she heard him. Footsteps running up the stairs, rapid and urgent. Dominic appeared in the corridor outside the nursery, and even through the closed door, Elena could see him, saw his dark suit torn and bloodied, saw the raw fury and fear in his expression as he approached. She opened the door before he could knock. He stood before her, breathing heavily, his dark eyes wild with something that transcended his usual control. Behind him, she could see blood on the hallway walls, could see broken furniture, could smell the acrid tang of violence. His security team was already working to contain the damage, to erase the evidence of whatever had transpired. His eyes found hers, and for a moment he simply stared at her, as if seeing her, truly seeing her, for the first time. Then his gaze moved past her to his daughters, still sleeping peacefully in their beds, untouched by the chaos that had erupted in the world below. The relief in his expression was so profound, so complete, that Elena saw the careful control he maintained crack and splinter. His shoulders seemed to collapse slightly, as if a tremendous weight had suddenly been placed upon them. He stepped into the nursery, moving to his daughters' beds, checking them, touching them, ensuring they lived and breathed and remained unharmed. When he turned back to Elena, there was something different in his face, a rawness, a vulnerability that couldn't be hidden. He looked at her for a long moment, and she understood without words what he was feeling. Gratitude, relief, but something deeper too, something darker and more complex. She should have been afraid. Perhaps she was afraid. But what she felt most acutely was a profound and unexpected surge of protectiveness. This man, dangerous, powerful, feared by men who were themselves frightening, had just experienced a moment of absolute terror, and Elena had protected his most precious possessions. Dominic walked to her, moving slowly, as if approaching something wild that might startle. Without speaking, without asking permission, he reached out and grasped her face gently in his hands. His thumbs traced her cheekbones, and she saw him take in every detail of her, as if memorizing her, as if fixing her in his mind so that he might never lose this image. Then he pulled her against his chest, his arms around her fierce and desperate, and Elena understood that in this moment she had become more to him than hired help. She had become protection. She had become safety. She had become someone he could not afford to lose. When he finally released her, he didn't speak. He couldn't speak. Instead, he returned to his daughters' bedsides, sitting between their beds, and remained there through the night, watching over them as the storm raged outside and Elena sat in the doorway, watching over all three of them. The aftermath of that night moved through the mansion like a ghost. By morning, all evidence of the violence had been erased. The blood was gone. The broken furniture had been replaced. The staff moved about their duties as if nothing had occurred. But everything had changed. Elena noticed it first in small ways. Dominic appeared in the nursery more frequently now, his presence less tentative, more integrated into the daily rhythm. He took breakfast with the girls. He sat with them in the afternoons. He read to them before bed, his dark voice filling the nursery with stories of adventure and redemption. But it was the way he looked at Elena that truly revealed the shift. The glances that had once been brief and guarded had become lingering and intense. When their hands accidentally touched, she felt his hesitation, felt the effort it cost him not to hold on. When she spoke, he listened with a focus that suggested nothing else in the world existed but her words. It terrified her. It thrilled her. It confused her in ways that made simple functioning difficult. Margaret began to treat her differently as well. There was a deference now, a respect that transcended professional courtesy. She started bringing Elena the finest linens, the best food from the kitchen. She called her Miss Rossi instead of Elena, a formality that suggested Elena's status in the household had fundamentally shifted. 2 weeks after the night of the attack, Dominic summoned her to his study. It was the first time she had been invited into that particular room, a space lined with leather books and dark wood, imposing and austere, with windows that overlooked the New York skyline, gray and endless beneath the winter sky. He stood at the window when she entered, and she was struck, as she always was, by the visual contradiction of him. A man built for darkness standing before light, a figure designed for shadow looking toward clarity. He didn't turn around immediately. He simply stood there, his hands clasped behind his back, and Elena waited, her heart performing an unfamiliar rhythm. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, controlled, the voice of a man accustomed to absolute authority. He told her things. Not everything. She understood even as he spoke that there were depths he would never fully reveal, but enough. He told her about his wife, about the accident, about how grief had nearly destroyed him. He told her about the business he ran, about the difficult choices men make when survival and power are the only currencies that matter. He told her about his fear that his daughters would grow up in a world of violence and fear, that they would lose the capacity to feel joy and gentleness. And then he told her about the night of the attack, how rivals had made a move, how his security team had responded, how in those moments of violence and danger, the only thing that had mattered was the knowledge that his daughters were safe because Elena was protecting them. He explained, without ever explicitly stating it, what she already knew, that he was dangerous, that his world was built on things that most people could not fathom, that loving him was perhaps the most foolish decision she could make. And then he asked her if she understood what would happen if she chose to stay. If she chose to remain in this mansion, in his life, in the lives of his daughters, did she understand the price she would pay? Elena wanted to lie. She wanted to tell him that she understood, that she was prepared, that she could handle whatever came next. But she had spent enough time in this mansion to learn that honesty was the only currency that had value between them. She told him the truth. She told him that she had been running for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to stop. She told him that his daughters had saved her as much as she had saved them, that in their innocence and their need, she had found a reason to believe that goodness existed in the world. She told him that she was terrified of the darkness that surrounded him, but that she was more terrified of walking away and losing the unexpected light she had found in this place. And she told him, finally, that she understood he was asking if she was willing to accept not just his love, but the cost of it, not just his devotion, but the danger that came with him, not just the warmth of his presence, but the shadows that followed. She said yes. He crossed the room and pulled her against him, and Elena understood that she was no longer hired help. She was something far more significant, far more complicated, far more binding than any contract could define. 3 months later, the seasons turned. Spring came to New York, bringing green leaves and the possibility of renewal. Elena had negotiated with Dominic. She had insisted on certain things. She would continue to have a role in the girls' lives, yes, but she would also have her own space, her own autonomy, her own identity, separate from what he was or what he needed her to be. He had agreed. Not easily, not without the internal struggle that any man of his nature would experience, but he had agreed. He had begun to make changes, subtle reshufflings of his operations, careful distancing from the more violent aspects of his business, strategic positioning that would allow him to eventually hand over control to less dangerous men. He was building a new kind of empire, one in which his daughters might actually have a future that didn't require them to fear. It was an unlikely redemption. It was probably an insufficient one, given the scope of what he had done and what he continued to do. But it was real, and it was sustained by daily choices to be something other than the world had made him. On a warm April evening, as Elena sat in the garden of the mansion with Sophia and Julia, watching them play in the fading light, she felt him arrive before she saw him. Dominic emerged from the mansion, and the girls ran to him without hesitation or fear. He scooped them both up, kissing the tops of their heads, and then looked at Elena over their small shoulders. His expression held everything that words could not contain: gratitude, wonder, the profound surprise of a man who had expected to spend his life in darkness finding himself standing in the light. He set the girls down and came to her, extending his hand. She took it, allowing him to pull her up from her chair. He didn't speak. He simply held her hand, and they stood together as their daughters played and the sun descended toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. In that moment, as the light softened and the world quieted, Elena understood what she had truly been hired to do. Not to care for the children, though she did that with all her heart. but to care for the part of him that could still feel, the part that had not been entirely consumed by the life he had been forced to live. She had been hired, it seemed, to save a soul she had never suspected could be saved, and in doing so, she had been saved herself. What an extraordinary journey this story has been. A tale of broken hearts finding wholeness, of shadows learning to embrace light, of the transformative power of compassion in the most unexpected places. Elena discovered that sometimes the most profound acts of courage are not grand gestures, but the simple choice to show up day after day, with gentleness and hope. This is a reminder that redemption is possible, that love has the power to reshape even the most carefully constructed walls, that sometimes, when we stop running from our past and choose to stand still, we find exactly what we've been searching for all along. If this story has moved you, if it has reminded you of the beauty and complexity of human connection, we would be deeply honored if you would subscribe to our channel. Join us as we continue to bring you stories of real people, real struggles, and the transformative power of hope. Subscribe now and don't miss the next chapter of human drama that will touch your heart and remind you why we tell stories. Thank you for being part of Elena and Dominic's journey. We'll see you in the next one.
5 years have a way of reshaping everything they touch. What was once a fragile beginning has grown into something solid, something real, something that has weathered every storm and emerged stronger on the other side. The Moretti mansion still stands on its hill overlooking the city, but it has transformed in ways both subtle and profound. The cold marble has been warmed by life, by photographs on walls, by children's laughter echoing through hallways, by the accumulated evidence of a family learning to exist together in genuine intimacy rather than performative propriety. The locked rooms on the second floor remain locked, but they are rarely entered. Dominic's world has shifted, compartmentalized in ways that allow him to maintain a certain distance from the darkness while never entirely escaping it. That is the bargain of men like him. They can change their choices, but they cannot entirely erase their past. Sophia is 10 years old now, no longer the silent, withdrawn child who sat on the nursery floor staring at nothing. She's vibrant, curious, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's gentle soul, though Elena has come to understand that Dominic's first wife lived mostly in photographs and in the careful way he speaks about her memory. Sophia is a reader, voracious in her appetite for stories, and she often sits in the library with Elena, discussing characters and plot developments with the seriousness of someone who understands that stories are not merely entertainment, but maps for navigating the world. Julia, also 10, is the adventurer. Where Sophia seeks understanding through words, Julia seeks it through experience. She is athletic, fearless, prone to scraping her knees and returning with stories of her explorations that make both Elena and Dominic simultaneously proud and anxious. She has inherited her father's intensity, but it manifests not in darkness, but in a kind of passionate engagement with life that is almost infectious. And there is Marco. Born 3 years ago on a spring morning that Elena will never forget, Marco is the child of Elena and Dominic's union, a small boy with his mother's lighter coloring and his father's sharp features, a living symbol of the bridge that connects two separate lives into something unified. His birth was complicated in ways that nearly broke Dominic entirely. Elena had hemorrhaged during delivery, and for 12 hours she hovered in a space between life and certain death while Dominic waited in a hospital corridor, his carefully maintained control finally completely shattered. She had survived. The doctors called it a miracle. Dominic called it proof that there existed some force in the universe more powerful than the darkness he had invited into his life. Elena called it luck and gratitude, and the extraordinary fortune of being loved by someone with the resources and determination to ensure she received the finest medical care available. The autumn of this 5th year arrived with particular beauty, the kind that makes poets weep and philosophers question their cynicism. Elena stood in the garden of the Moretti estate on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, her hands buried in the soil as she planted bulbs that would bloom in spring. This had become her ritual, this annual recommitment to growth and renewal, this physical act of faith that there would be future seasons, future blooms, future reasons to believe in transformation. Marco played nearby, his small hands attempting to mimic his mother's movements, dirt already coating his clothes and face, his concentration absolute. At 3.5, he possessed the kind of unself-conscious joy that had been largely absent from his older sister's childhoods. He had been born into safety, into love that was neither tentative nor contingent. The tragic weight that Sophia and Julia carried, the memory of their mother, the knowledge of their father's darkness, was not part of his inheritance. Elena watched him and felt, as she often did now, a kind of gratitude so profound it bordered on pain. She had been hired to care for children. She had chosen to care for a man. She had, in the process, been saved and transformed beyond recognition. The sound of an engine drew her attention. A car was entering the property. Not the kind of vehicle that typically meant danger. She had learned to recognize the difference between visitors who came for legitimate business and those who came because of Dominic's other life. This was a familiar car. Marco looked up from his gardening, his small face brightening with recognition, and Elena felt her own heart respond to the sound of footsteps on the garden path. Dominic emerged from around the corner of the mansion, and even after 5 years, Elena was struck by something in her chest when she saw him. He wore a charcoal suit, expensive and perfectly tailored, and his dark hair showed the first threads of silver at the temples, a change so subtle that only someone who loved him as intimately as Elena did would notice it. His face carried the weight of responsibility, of choices made and consequences carried, but there was something else there now too. There was peace. Not the peace of someone who had escaped his past, but the peace of someone who had integrated it, who had chosen to be something other than what circumstance had demanded. His eyes found Eleanor across the garden, and in that moment, in that simple act of seeing her, she felt the fundamental rightness of every decision that had led to this point. He smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had learned to be happy, a rare and precious thing. Marco abandoned his gardening with the single-minded focus of small children and ran toward his father, his little legs pumping, his mouth forming words that emerged as excited nonsense. Dominic scooped him up, lifting him high and spinning him, and the child's laughter filled the garden like birdsong, like music, like the sound of a world that was still capable of innocence. When Dominic set Marco down, he came to Elena, and without speaking, without the elaborate formality that sometimes still marked their interactions, he pulled her close. His lips found hers, and she tasted everything that 5 years of love and compromise and difficult choices had made possible. "The girls are at school?" he asked when they finally separated. Elena nodded. "Sophia has her literature club. Julia has soccer practice. Margaret is picking them up at 5. She paused, searching his face. "You came home early." His expression shifted slightly, and Elena knew that something significant had occurred. After 5 years, she had learned to read the subtle gradations of his mood, the small tells that indicated when something had shifted in his carefully maintained world. "I have something to tell you," he said, "all of you. But first I need to show you something." He took her hand and led her toward the house, Marco running ahead with the boundless energy of childhood. Elena followed, feeling the familiar mixture of curiosity and caution that had characterized so much of her time with this man. She had learned not to be afraid of the unknown anymore. Fear was a luxury she could no longer afford, but she remained vigilant, aware that every piece contained within it the potential for disruption. Dominic led her to his study, the same room where 5 years ago he had laid bare the fundamental truths of his world and asked her if she was willing to accept the consequences of loving him. The room was unchanged in its architecture, but had evolved in its purpose. The heavy furniture remained, but now there were photographs on the walls. Elena and the girls, Marco as a newborn, family moments captured in time. There was a painting of Dominic's first wife, rendered in soft watercolors, honored but not haunting. From his desk drawer, Dominic withdrew a folder, and when he opened it, Elena understood why he had come home early. "I'm transferring operational control," he said, his voice steady and certain. "It's done, legally binding as of this morning. I'm no longer the head of the organization." Elena's breath caught. This had been a goal, a distant possibility they had discussed in hushed tones during late nights when the children were sleeping. But she had never truly believed it would happen, had assumed that some threads of his previous life would remain tangled around him forever. "To whom?" she asked carefully. "To men who are better suited to it," Dominic replied. "Men who don't have 3 children, who need their father to be something other than what I was. The transition is already underway. There will still be business to manage, but it will be legitimate now. Investments, real estate, the infrastructure of legitimate wealth. The rest," he gestured vaguely, indicating the part of his life that lived in shadow, "is being handled by those who never learned, as I did, that there are better ways to live." Elena sat down slowly in one of the leather chairs, processing what this meant. "How long?" she asked. "How long until you're completely clear?" 2 years, he said, "perhaps 3. There are complications, loose ends, relationships that must be carefully severed. But it's beginning, Elena. It's truly beginning." He knelt before her, taking both her hands in his, and she saw in his eyes the same vulnerability she had glimpsed on the night of the attack, the moment when she had understood that beneath his control, beneath his power, lived a man desperately afraid of losing everything that mattered. "I did this for them," he said, "for Sophia and Julia and Marco, but I did it for you most of all. I did it because I couldn't bear the idea that you might one day look at me with regret, that you might someday wake up and wish you had chosen differently." Eleanor leaned forward and kissed his forehead, understanding that this was his way of saying "I love you," understanding that for a man like him, such declarations of affection had to be undercut with practicality and action. She had learned to translate his language of commitment, had learned that his version of devotion was expressed not in poetry, but in sacrifice, not in words, but in the fundamental restructuring of his life. When Sophia and Julia arrived home from their respective activities, Dominic gathered the family in the sitting room that had become their informal gathering space. The girls sensed something significant in the air. Children are attuned to such shifts in family weather. They sat on the sofa, Marco nestled between them, while Elena and Dominic occupied the chairs across from them. Dominic explained in language that was both honest and age-appropriate that he was making changes to his work, that there would be more time with him, more family dinners, more ordinary moments of being together, that the world was complicated and sometimes people had to do things they weren't proud of, but that he was learning that it was never too late to make different choices. Sophia, with the perceptiveness of a 10-year-old who had already learned to read between lines, simply nodded and reached over to squeeze her father's hand. Julia asked practical questions about what this meant for their routines, whether he would be home for her soccer games, whether they might finally take that vacation to Italy that he had been promising for years. And Marco, too young to understand the significance of what was being shared, simply wanted to know if this meant his father could come to his school's career day and tell everyone what he did. Dominic and Elena exchanged a glance, that particular look that has developed between them over 5 years of navigating the complex terrain of building a life together. A look that contained laughter and resignation, and the kind of love that is earned through choosing each other, day after day, in the face of challenges most people never have to contemplate. After the children were asleep, Elena and Dominic sat together on the terrace overlooking the city. The autumn night was cool, crisp, with the promise of winter, and Elena wore one of Dominic's sweaters, drawn around her like armor and comfort simultaneously. "Do you have regrets?" Dominic asked suddenly, the question emerging from the darkness as if it had been weighing on him all day. Elena considered this carefully. She had learned that Dominic's questions were rarely casual, that they usually contained the weight of genuine vulnerability, and that he deserved honesty in response. "Sometimes," she admitted, "I wonder what my life would have been if I had never answered that job posting. I wonder if I would have rebuilt myself differently, if I would have created a different kind of life. But I don't regret the choice I made, not ever." "Why?" he asked, and she could hear in his voice the genuine puzzlement of someone who had expected her to say something else. "Because regret implies that I would undo something," Elena said. "And I would never undo this. I would never undo Sophia's laughter or Julia's fearlessness or Marco's existence. I would never undo learning that you are capable of change, that love can exist in spaces where we least expect it. I would never undo finding myself through helping you find yourself." Dominic reached over and took her hand, pulling it to rest on his chest, and Elena felt his heartbeat, steady, strong, alive. "I was a very different person when you arrived," he said quietly. "I was hollow. The girls were suffering, the house was dying. And then you came, and you brought something with you that I didn't even know I was missing. You brought the possibility that I could be more than what I had been made to be. You brought that possibility to yourself," Elena corrected. "I simply reminded you it existed." Madum. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the lights of New York sprawl before them, a city of millions of stories, millions of struggles, millions of people attempting to reconcile who they were with who they wished to be. Spring returned to New York with the inevitability of seasons that refused to acknowledge human suffering. The bulbs that Eleanor had planted that autumn bloomed in spectacular array, tulips and daffodils and crocuses, painting the garden in colors that seemed to hold promises of renewal and redemption. It was on an April morning, similar in many ways to the April morning 5 years ago, when Elena had stood watching Sophia and Julia play in the garden, that something new arrived in the Moretti household. Elena woke to the sensation of pain, the specific and undeniable pain of labor, and she reached for Dominic in the darkness. She felt him come fully awake immediately, felt the shift in his body as he moved from sleep to action to purpose. This was their second child together, but the fear that had characterized their first experience had not entirely dissipated. Children were risks. Birth was always a kind of gambling with the universe, but this time the delivery was uncomplicated. The universe, it seemed, had mercy in its capacity after all. And when the doctor placed a small baby girl into Eleanor's arms, when Dominic looked down at his newborn daughter, when Sophia and Julia and Marco came into the hospital room to meet their new sister, something fundamental shifted once again in the story that had begun with a young woman arriving at a mansion in the rain. They named her Grace. In Italian, the name is Grazia, and Dominic chose to use this version, creating a bridge between his heritage and the new world they were building. But it was the English meaning that seemed most appropriate. Grace, that unearned blessing, that unexpected gift of life, given to those who had not deserved it but desperately needed it. Looking at this small child, Elena understood something she had been slowly learning over 5 years, but had never quite fully articulated. She had been hired to care for his children, but the real work had never been about the children at all. The real work had been about transformation, about two broken people finding in each other the possibility of wholeness, about a man learning that redemption was not a destination, but a daily practice, about a woman discovering that running could end and staying could begin. 5 years after Eleanor first arrived at the mansion, Dominic organized a celebration. Not a party in the traditional sense, Dominic had never been someone who sought social validation or public acknowledgement, but a gathering of the people who mattered. Margaret, who had served the family for decades and had evolved from gatekeeper to something resembling an extended family member. The girls' tutors. A few of Dominic's associates who had known him in both his former and current lives and could appreciate the scope of his transformation. The medical team that had saved Eleanor's life twice over. They gathered in the garden on a warm May evening as the sun descended toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Sophia and Julia helped decorate, stringing lights through the trees. Marco and Grace sat in the grass, Marco attempting to teach his baby sister about the wonders of dirt. Elena stood with Dominic, watching the scene unfold before them, and felt something in her settle into place. A sense of belonging, of home, of having finally arrived at a destination she didn't know she'd been traveling toward. "Do you remember?" Dominic asked, his hand finding the small of her back. "The first night you stood in this garden." Elena did remember. She remembered the cold, the darkness, the uncertainty. She remembered being a woman with no past and no future, only the present moment and the fragile hope that something better might exist. "I was so afraid," she admitted. "I know," Dominic said. "I could see it in your face. But you stayed. You chose to stay even when staying made no sense." "You gave me reasons to stay," Elena replied. "No," Dominic said, and she heard in his voice the certainty of someone who had done considerable thinking about this particular point. "You chose to see the reasons that were already there. That's the difference between someone who is forced into a story and someone who chooses to be part of creating one." And as if on cue, Sophia came running over to tell them that everyone was ready to eat, and they moved toward the tables that had been set up on the lawn. But Elena paused for just a moment, turning back to look at the mansion, this structure of stone and history and secrets, this fortress that had become a home. She thought about the girl she had been when she arrived, the woman she had become through the process of caring for others while gradually learning to care for herself. She thought about how transformation rarely announces itself, how it occurs in small moments, a child's smile, a hand held in darkness, a choice made in the face of uncertainty. She thought about Dominic, about the man who had been shaped by violence and loss, but who had chosen, through incremental decisions and accumulated moments of vulnerability, to become something other than what circumstance had demanded. She thought about the children, all of them, not just the biological heirs, but the chosen ones as well, and about how each generation gets to rewrite the story, to choose differently, to build something new on the foundation of what came before. And she understood, finally and completely, what it meant to have been hired only to care for someone else's children, only to discover that she had been hired for something far greater. She had been hired to be a mirror. She had been hired to reflect back to a broken man the possibility of his own redemption. She had been hired, in the most fundamental sense, to teach a family what it meant to love without fear, to trust without condition, to believe that even in the darkest circumstances, transformation was possible. The evening unfolded as such gatherings do, with food and conversation, with laughter and the small moments of connection that make life bearable and, sometimes, even beautiful. And as Elena moved through the garden with Dominic at her side, their children around them, she felt the last remnants of her old life dissolve into nothing more significant than memory. She had been running when she arrived. She had been seeking escape, seeking erasure, seeking the possibility of becoming someone else, someone unburdened by history. But what she had found instead was not escape, but arrival. Not erasure, but creation. Not a new self, but a self redeemed through love and commitment and the daily choice to believe in possibility. She had been hired to care for his children, but she had become so much more than that. She had become his peace in a world built on chaos. She had become the proof that even the most broken hearts could learn to beat again with wholeness and hope. And in the process, she had discovered that sometimes the greatest redemption is not found in erasing the past, but in choosing every single day to build something better in the present. If you have stayed with us through this story, through all 5 years compressed into the span of a few hours, we hope you have felt what we felt in creating it. The profound truth that love is not a destination, but a practice. That redemption is not a single moment, but a collection of moments, a series of choices made in the face of fear and doubt. Elena's journey reminds us that sometimes we are placed in situations not to escape our past, but to finally face it and transcend it through connection with others. Dominic's transformation shows us that no person is irredeemable, that even those shaped by darkness can choose to move toward light. This is a story about hope. It is a story about the power of compassion to reshape not just individual lives, but entire families, entire destinies. It is a story about the extraordinary courage it takes to love someone complex, someone broken, someone who carries shadows, but is desperately trying to find the light. If this story has moved you, if it has reminded you that redemption is always possible, that love can exist in the most unlikely circumstances, we invite you to subscribe to our channel. Join our community of story lovers, of people who believe that narratives have the power to inspire, to heal, to transform. The next story is waiting. The next journey is beginning. And we would be honored if you would travel with us once again. Thank you for believing in Elena and Dominic. Thank you for seeing their story as something worth witnessing. Thank you for understanding that the most powerful tales are not those of heroes who never fall, but of people who fall and choose every single day to rise again. Subscribe now. Share this story with someone who needs to believe in redemption. And we will see you in the next chapter, because everyone deserves a story. Everyone deserves to be seen, to be valued, to be loved, not for who they are supposed to be, but for who they are becoming.